Hi, and welcome to today's episode of How the Game Was Won. Before we get into today's game, we must just mention that in a major international chess match between two players, the last time a player came back from a 2-0 deficit after the first two games was back in Reykjavik 1972, when Bobby Fischer overcame his 2-0 deficit after the first two games to come back and win the match by 12.5 to 8.5. The difference between that match and this one in the final of the Chess World Cup is that under the classical time controls it's a match of only 4 games, which means that a 2-0 deficit results in 2 must-win games back-to-back, which makes it a far more onerous task than what Fischer had in 1972, bearing in mind that back in 1972, Fischer had approximately a 70-point to 80-point rating difference between himself and Spassky, bearing in mind that Spassky was just over 2700 and Fischer was 2775 at the time. Here we've got Karjakin at 2762 and Svidler at 2727, so you're talking about a 35 rating point difference, which really, especially in today's chess, isn't really that much at all. So with that little bit of history out of the way, let's have a look at how the game was won. This is game 4, the final classical time control game of the FIDE Chess World Cup for 2015 being played in Baku. And here we have Sergei Karjakin with the white pieces versus Peter Svidler with the black pieces. And without further ado, let's have a look at how the opening transpired. And as you can see, with c4, Cxd4, Cxd5, knight f6, queen takes d4, queen takes d5, knight c3, queen takes d4, knight takes d4. The queens are already off the board, and you have a completely symmetrical pawn structure here. And it must be noted that all through the Chess World Cup, Karjakin, even in must-win games, hasn't shied away from symmetrical pawn positions. And getting back to basics, often what you'll want to achieve out of the opening or as soon into the middle game as possible is an asymmetrical pawn structure where you have a pawn majority on the one side of the board versus the pawn majority on your opponent's side of the board. You then both try to neutralize your opponent's pawn majority on whichever side of the board he has. Say you've got the king side and he's got the queen side. You try and neutralize that queen side pawn majority by winning one of the excess pawns on that side of the board. You then try to convert your side of the board's pawn majority into a passed pawn. That's the normal way of slow developmental pawn structural way of building your position. But here in this situation, as you can see, the pawn structure is totally symmetrical. The queens are off the board, and all of this would normally be leading towards a drawish position. The only thing that's really counting in Karjakin's favor at the moment is he's got a developmental advantage. He's already got 2 minor pieces developed as opposed to Svidler's 1. The game continued. Bishop d7, knight Bd5 king d8, bishop e3, knight c6, f3, h5, which we can assume was to prevent the g4 from being played, but it seems rather drastic to push the h5, because that leaves you with a gaping hole sitting at g5. We continue with Karjakin castle long, which means that by castling long, he's looking at pushing pawns on the king side because he doesn't have to worry about these pawns giving protective blockade for his king, so he's free to push them up the board and use that to potentially pick up an extra pawn and maybe develop a pass pawn on the king side of the board. Continuing with king c8, bishop g5, g6, knight d6 check, e takes d6, bishop takes f6, rook g8, e4, bishop e6, king b1, king d7, knight d5, bishop g7, bishop takes on g7, rook takes on g7, and bishop b5. You can't exactly say that black is losing anything right at the moment, but he's got this problem of the rook sitting on g7, which isn't really going anywhere. That pawn blockade means that the rook potentially needs to say, for instance, move back and across and back out, and from there yet again move across to be able to get to generate anything, or for that matter the other alternative could be to move straight across like that to be able to pick up the c file, whereas by comparison all that white would need to do is make one single rook move to be able to neutralize that entire maneuver. So he's got that awkward rook, and then not to mention the fact that this pawn sitting over here on d6 is really isolated and doesn't give much cover to the black king either. So his position is unpleasant, but not really, you can say, losing. And then continue king d8, rook d2. Meanwhile, you can see that white's play is rather obvious. You've got, as I mentioned, this obvious target of d6, and you've got the rook sitting on d2, ready for instance, another rook to double into d1. That puts immense pressure onto that d6 square, and bear in mind that as soon as d6 falls, white will then have 4 pawns versus black's 3, which is obviously a really good position to get into, which is then getting back into the idea of pushing for an asymmetrical pawn structure, and bearing in mind that you'd like to have an asymmetrical pawn structure on the side of the board that you'll be looking at wanting to push your pawn. And what's more, as far as this position is concerned, black's king has already moved, so which means that the king is effectively trapped in the middle of the board and will not be able to castle. Continuing, bishop takes on d5, rook takes on d5, king c7, rook c1, rook e8, rook d4, rook e5, bishop a4, b5, bishop b3, rook c5. Obviously, Svidler over here is trying to gain some sort of activity, but at the same time, the white's pieces are far more mobile, far better positioned on the same side of the board as where the very vulnerable looking black king is. Continuing, rook d5, rook takes c1, check, king takes c1, a6, rook d3, g5. And obviously it's intuitive for black to keep the pawns on the black squares simply because white has a white square bishop. So if the pawns are on black squares, there's no way that the white bishop can pick them off. King d2, h4, rook c3, king b6, rook d3, king c7, king e3, f6, rook c3, king b6, rook d3, king c7, rook c3, king b6, bishop b5, bishop d5 rather, knight e7, king d4, and now that the dust has more or less settled through the middle game. Now white can continue pressing, bearing in mind that the position of that black rook that I mentioned a while ago, sitting off on g7, is still sitting on g7, and although it's a possibility for black to be playing something along the lines of f5, the positioning of the rook, that still doesn't solve the positioning of the rook. Possibly after something along the lines of f5, the rook could potentially come up to g6, which will then give some sort of line of defense against that very vulnerable d6 pawn. But the game continued with rook h7, bishop e6, rook h8, a3, rook d8, rook c2, rook h8, rook f2, knight g6, king d5, rook d8, bishop f5, knight f4, king d4. And now you can really see that black is in trouble. He's been playing in a very passive manner all the way through the game, and that passivity is now coming home to roost. You can easily see that the move g3 is coming, and after that it's going to be a case of each pawn trade-off on the king side of the board is going to be more of an advantage to white's king side pawns. For instance, after rook e8 was the option, you've got black could have played d5 with e5, or for that matter d5 with g3, d takes e4, king e3, knight d5, king e4, rook d6, which is fairly close to equal. Whereas after the e5, you've got f takes e5, king takes e5, d4, rook d2, king c5, and although white is still better, it certainly doesn't put the game so firmly to his advantage. But the game continued with g3, knight e6, bishop takes on e6, rook takes on e6, king d5, and black loses the pawn, and because of the difference in activity of these pieces, the endgame will turn out to be completely useless. We've got rook e5 check, king takes d6, h takes g3, h takes g3, and g4 gets played. F takes g4. Now, bearing in mind, keep a close eye on this g4 pawn. If white is able to, for instance, trade off those pawns, there's absolutely nothing stopping that g pawn from going all the way through to the queening square at the end. For instance, we got rook e4 was played and rook f4, which is the last and final detail to win the game. For instance, rook takes f6 was possible with rook g4, but it's still way less clear than what was played, simply because at the moment you've got black busy covering that white pawn, and that makes it just that much more difficult to win. Whereas after rook f4, there's absolutely nothing to stop black whatsoever. So stop white whatsoever. We've got rook e3, rook takes on f6, rook takes on g3, king e5 with a discovered check, king b7. For instance, the other option is king c5, b4 check, king c4, rook c6 check, king b3, king f4, rook g2, rook takes on a6, which is equally bad to what was actually played. And then again, no matter what Svidler played, the endgame is getting further and further and further out of reach. King f5 was played. Now, as soon as the king lands in f5, we've got the king giving support to the white pawn, and it's just a straight march through to the end of the board. Rook b3, g5, rook takes on b2, g6, and there's absolutely nothing that black can do to be able to stop the pawn from getting to the end of the board. For instance, should black come across with something along the lines of a rook to back across to g2, for instance, that pawn is going to be getting through to the end of the board, because we can take the rook along to there, followed by the king coming up, and the king will be able to then give protection there, which means that the pawn can advance and then to there, and black will have to give up this rook to be able to exchange off for the newly queened, and then you'll have white with a clear rook up and an easily won endgame. And with that, what was barreling down ahead of him, Svidler resigned in this position, and Karjakin picks up the point to level the game at 2 games all, which means tomorrow we head into tiebreakers. And we have to wait and see who comes out better in the tiebreaker. And bearing in mind that at one stage Svidler was 2-0 up in this match, he must be absolutely kicking himself this evening, having lost 2 games in a row and let the match get away from him. Whether or not that will impact him majorly psychologically running into tomorrow's tiebreakers, we'll have to wait and see. But that, my friends, is how this game was won. Please feel free to share this video out amongst your chess friends. Don't forget to click the thumbs up button below the video if you like this type of content. Thumbs down if you don't, that way I'll know how to be improving in the future. And please post any comments, questions, criticisms that you may have down below. That way you'll be able to help me to improve these videos in the days, weeks and months going forward. And also, last but by no means least, if you're watching this video within the YouTube channel, down just below the video screen is a big red subscribe button. Hit that subscribe button, that way you stay subscribed to my channel for all the new content that will be coming out on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. Until I see you next time for another episode of How the Game Was Won, stay carved up for the win and stay safe out there. Cheers.